As the 19th century drew to a close, two very different men would step up to make the case for each of these options. It would rupture the movement in two. The rapid rise of socialism in Germany frightened the country's rulers. In 1878, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck outlawed all socialist activities, driving many members of the Social Democratic Party into exile. Among them was a young bank clerk named Edward Bernstein. He soon became editor of the party's clandestine newspaper, first in Switzerland and then in London.
When Bernstein goes to England, he becomes acquainted with Marx and Engels, and Marx and Engels become very enamored of him. And after Marx dies, Engels asks Bernstein if he will put together from Marx's notes a fourth volume of Capital. And when Engels dies, he also is asked to be one of the executors of Engels' will. So he was very closely tied to Marx and Engels and seen in the period after their death as one of the most important international socialists.
But Bernstein lived in a very different era from that of his mentors. Standards of living were changing, just not in the way Karl Marx had predicted. It wasn't long before Bernstein began to question his Marxist faith.
I think that he thought that capitalism was evolving along the lines of becoming more and more inclusive of the working class. And he had some empirical evidence which showed that the working class was not getting poorer, and it showed that therefore the Marxist vision, somehow something was wrong with it.
Bernstein decided he had to face his doubts. "I said to myself," he wrote, "this cannot go on. It is idle to try to reconcile the irreconcilable. What is necessary is to become clear just where Marx is right and where he is wrong." Bernstein's critique became known as revisionism, and it stirred up an urgent debate among socialists around the world.
Bernstein said that what usually is understood to be the final goal of socialism is nothing to me. The movement is everything. That really caused consternation in the party, because people thought that Bernstein had given up the great goal, and the great goal of socialism, as we know, of course, was the breakdown of capitalism, and Bernstein was no longer interested in, or did no longer believe in, the breakdown of capitalism. And if that's the case, then Bernstein actually was no longer a Marxist socialist, and if that's the case, it's as though the Pope in Rome was no longer a Catholic.
Thousands of miles away, a 29-year-old Siberian exile was carefully following the debate. His eventual response to Bernstein's criticisms would forever change the face of socialism. His name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by his nom de guerre, Lenin.
Lenin was, first of all, probably Russia's most exuberant workaholic in a country that did not have a work ethic. He was enormously hardworking. He was enormously smart. He had supreme self-confidence and a belief that he really knew what was right for everybody, and particularly for the future of his country.
When Vladimir was 17, his older brother Sasha was executed for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. It was the beginning of his own path to revolutionary action.
After he got to the university, and he took part in a demonstration, which was not political. It was directed against some regulations of the university. When he was arrested, and it was discovered that he was the younger brother of the executed terrorist, he was expelled from the university. He was a top student, so he had to spend several years in idleness.
Vladimir was banished to his family's country estate. There, he began to explore the stacks of radical literature his executed brother had left behind.
He read various Russian revolutionaries, read Karl Marx, and began to come to the conclusion that it was just as important as his brother had thought to create a new social system for Russia, that revolutionaries had to learn to toughen themselves, to make themselves into heroes who were going to give their all to save Russia, something like his brother had done.
Vladimir's revolutionary activity would land him in deeper trouble with the law. By the time he heard about Edward Bernstein's writings nearly a decade later, he was in exile yet again, this time in Siberia. His life now revolved around one goal: revolution.
Lenin was an individual who was often in a state of rage. That was his personality. But he was infuriated by Bernstein. But unlike a lot of the others, Lenin in effect realized that Bernstein was right, that the workers were not becoming revolutionary.
When Lenin returned from exile, his younger brother met him at the train station. Dmitry Ulyanov would later recall the first topic on his brother's lips: the need to refute Bernstein. Lenin soon laid out a radically different idea of what to do if the workers wouldn't make the revolution.
He developed quite early on what I would call a politics based on the absence of trust. So if you can't then trust the workers to make a revolution, whom can you trust? And Lenin said the only people you can trust are full-time professional revolutionaries like himself, who will make a revolution in the name of the people.
Lenin in effect said, heck with the workers, the revolution is everything. Except Lenin wasn't quite that honest. He didn't say, heck with the workers. He said, we'll have to discover the vanguard of the workers or of the proletariat, and that will be, well, me and my pals, and we'll make the revolution for the workers.
For Lenin, this was more than just a theory. In 1900, he left for Europe to start an underground newspaper, Iskra, or Spark, to ignite a new revolutionary movement in Russia. In the summer of 1914, 50 years of peace in Europe came to a bloody end. Soon the entire continent was mired in the fiercest conflict the world had yet seen. The Great War hit Russia particularly hard.
There was a breakdown of transport. There was inflation. And in the northern cities, particularly the capital city of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was then called, there were great shortages of food and fuel. So the winter was very, very harsh.
By early 1917, the ground was crumbling beneath the Tsarist regime. As Russian troops battled Germany in the west, strikes and protests spread across the country. Then, in Petrograd, a group of soldiers mutinied. It was the beginning of what became known as the February Revolution. To prevent a similar uprising on the front, the Tsar abdicated the throne. Power fell into the hands of a liberal provisional government.
There was a kind of chaos and anarchy that grew very quickly in Russia after the February Revolution, after the emperor had abdicated. Land was being seized by peasants. Villages were declaring their independence and sewing their own flags. And you have the idea that whatever the bonds, the glue that will hold a society together, fear, loyalty, tradition, it somehow melted away and evaporated, with Russia crumbling into the smallest parts.
Many Russian socialists welcomed the new liberal government, but not Lenin. He had lived in exile in Europe for most of the past 15 years, sometimes traveling in disguise. All the while, he had worked to strengthen and arm a new party in Russia, the Bolsheviks, even ordering bank robberies and extortion to finance party activities. Now he saw the chance he had been waiting for. On October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks struck. This is a later Soviet reenactment of Lenin's men storming the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. In reality, the revolution was much less dramatic. The provisional government yielded with little bloodshed. Many didn't expect the new regime to hold on to power any longer than the provisional government had.
When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, they really were a tiny minority. And immediately, the Bolshevik regime found itself embroiled in a civil war, which it won militarily, but it also won because the Bolsheviks had been very successful in their use of propaganda to win what we might nowadays call the hearts and minds of the Russian people.
Through posters, leaflets, and speeches, Lenin tried to convince Russians of just who were the enemies of the people and who were their saviors. But Lenin didn't stop with propaganda. The enemies of the people were marked for retribution, including priests, rich peasants, and political opponents. Lenin began with Nicholas II, the last Tsar to reign over Russia.
Him, his wife, their 5 children, their doctor, their servants were all massacred. And then their bodies were cut up and burned, and then what was remained was buried in a shaft, which was only discovered a few years ago. Then, in August of 1918, a revolutionary who felt that Lenin had betrayed the revolution took 2 shots at him and wounded him almost fatally. Whereupon Lenin and his henchmen agreed to carry out Red Terror. This was a terrible thing. People were taken out of prison where they were put political prisoners who had never been tried, had done nothing against the Bolsheviks, and were just summarily shot. And this shooting went on. Hundreds of people were shot at night.
Many others found themselves banished to forced labor camps. Under Joseph Stalin, the system would become known as the Gulag.
A part of the Red Terror was the gathering of all opposition members into concentration camps outside of major cities. And these were the very first camps, and it was from these camps that the entire Gulag system developed. So they are very much a precursor to what came later in Stalin's time.
The Tsar had been reviled as a tyrant for executing a handful of violent radicals. Under Lenin and his followers, millions would die at the hands of the state.
It's difficult to calculate how many people came to die under Lenin's system and then Stalin's system because there were so many different ways to die. There were people who died in camps. There were people who died because they were machine gunned down in the woods. There were people who died because they were deported. There were people who died in artificial famines. When you begin to put the numbers together, you get statistics in the tens of millions.
Lenin, in general, had no sympathy for human beings such as they were. He believed, as did others, that through education and legislation you can make people not want to own things. You create new human beings. So the existing human race was so rotten that killing them was actually progressive.
Amidst terror and war, Lenin was building a system of government unlike any seen before. Along with the old regime, Russia's capitalist industries, the banks, and the church were all completely destroyed. Replacing them all was a single institution, the party.